Here is what I keep coming back to. 2 years after it ended. Not the money. Though the money is gone, and at 66 years old, that fact has a particular quality of permanence that I won't pretend doesn't terrify me. Not the relationship, though that ended in ways I'm still working through. What I keep returning to is the specific, clinical failure of my own professional judgment. For 30 years I sat across tables from lawyers in negotiations that involved hundreds of millions of dollars. I read contracts. I interrogated assumptions. I built a career out of knowing, with precision, whose interests each person in a room was actually serving. And then I moved to Bangkok and handed everything I owned to a man whose job, whose actual paid function in the arrangement, was to work against me, and I thanked him. That's the part I can't get past. I thanked him at the end of every meeting, shook his hand, and went home feeling like I was in good hands. I want to explain how that happens to a person who should have known better. I want to explain it carefully, because the version of this story where I'm simply a fool is too easy, and also, I think, too convenient for people who haven't been where I was. The version worth understanding is more complicated than that. My name is Douglas. I spent 31 years in operations management for a Fortune 500 logistics company headquartered in Atlanta. I started in their Memphis distribution center at 32, worked my way through regional director, then VP of operations for North America, and finished as senior director of global supply chain with a team of 400 people across 9 countries. I was good at it. I was very good at it. The job required a specific kind of intelligence, systems thinking, risk assessment, the ability to identify where the incentives in a structure were misaligned before those misalignments cost the company money. I did that professionally for 3 decades. I was, I believed, unusually difficult to deceive. I retired in September 2021 at 64. The package was generous. A severance component, vested stock options, and a deferred compensation payout that together came to just over $575,000 after federal tax. My wife of 22 years had died of ovarian cancer in 2018, 2 weeks before what would have been our anniversary. My 2 sons were grown, settled, in different cities, living their lives with appropriate distance from their father's grief. I sold the house in Buckhead in March 2020, couldn't stand being in it, and moved into a corporate apartment near the office that I'd been using for 18-hour days anyway. When the retirement package cleared in October 2021, I was 64 years old. I had $575,000, no home, no particular plan, and the kind of exhausted emptiness that I think you only arrive at after you've spent 3 years working hard enough to outrun something that runs faster than work. A colleague, a man named Steve who'd done a secondment in our Bangkok operation in 2016, had mentioned Thailand to me probably 6 times over the years, in the casual way people mention places they've loved. After my wife died, he mentioned it again, more directly, that the quality of life, the cost of living, and the particular texture of the place had done something for him at a difficult period in his own life. After I retired, he mentioned it once more, and this time I booked a flight the following week. I didn't overthink it. I was done with overthinking things. I arrived in Bangkok in November 2021 on a tourist visa, arranged through the Royal Thai Embassy in Washington. I had a room booked at a serviced apartment in the Silom district. Steve had recommended the neighborhood, said it was central without being chaotic, and I had approximately no idea what I was doing, which for the first time in many years felt like a relief rather than a problem. I walked the streets around Silom and Sathorn those first days with the focused purposelessness of someone who has nowhere to be and is still getting used to that. I ate at street stalls, and at hotels, and at places I stumbled into without knowing what they were. I took the BTS SkyTrain because the air conditioning was good and I liked watching the city from above. I was not, at that stage, looking for anything in particular. I met Benz at a private members club near Saladang that Steve had arranged temporary access for me through a mutual contact. She was there for a corporate function. She worked as a senior legal secretary at a mid-sized commercial law firm that operated out of a building on Sathorn Road, and her firm had been hosting a client event. We were introduced through the mutual contact, who knew her professionally. That's important. This was not a bar, not a tourist district, not an encounter of the kind that people assume when they hear this type of story. This was a professionally situated introduction at a private venue, with a mutual contact, to a woman who worked in law. I want you to understand what that meant to a man who spent 30 years making judgments about people based on their professional context. She appeared, in every respect, to be exactly what the setting suggested she was. She was 30 years old, educated at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, English fluent in the specific, careful way of someone who learned it formally, rather than conversationally. She sometimes reached for a word and found a slightly formal equivalent, which I found charming. She was composed. She asked me questions about logistics management that indicated she'd understood what I'd said about my career the first time, which is not as common as it should be. We talked for an hour and a half, and I left with her business card and the intention of seeing her again, which felt for the first time since 2018 like an intention that wasn't about running from something. We had dinner at a restaurant near Lumpini Park the following week, and then again the week after. By December, she was showing me Bangkok in the way only a resident can: the food court at Samyan Mittertown, the flower market near Pa Klong Talat at 5 in the morning, the particular light on the Chao Phraya River at dusk from a spot she knew near Tha Tien. She was not performing the city for me. She was sharing it. Or that was how it felt. Looking back, I understand the difference between those two things is entirely in the framing, and the framing was hers. I want to account for why I trusted her as quickly as I did, because I think the explanation is more instructive than the simple fact of it. Benz was not a woman who made you feel swept away. She was a woman who made you feel seen. There is a meaningful difference. Swept away implies a loss of agency. You're carried by something larger than yourself. You surrender judgment to sensation. What Benz did was more precise than that. She asked questions and retained the answers. When I mentioned in our third dinner conversation that my wife had collected Thai ceramics, that she'd had a particular piece, a celadon bowl from Chiang Rai, that had sat on our kitchen windowsill for 15 years, Benz remembered it and asked about it again 6 weeks later in a completely different context, when we were passing a ceramics shop near the Chatuchak weekend market. That kind of attention doesn't feel like manipulation when it's happening. It feels like intimacy. It feels like someone deciding you are worth paying careful attention to. For a man who had been functionally invisible to himself for 3 years, it felt significant. She told me about her family in gradual, proportioned installments. Her father was a retired civil servant from the Ministry of Commerce. Her mother taught secondary school English in the Phra Nakhon district. She had one older brother who worked in property development and an uncle, Wirasak, who had been in business for himself for many years, the nature of which she described vaguely as investment and property. Her family was educated, Bangkok-based, urban middle class in the Thai sense of that phrase. Nothing about her background raised the signals I'd been wired to read. She didn't come from poverty and wasn't seeking rescue. She didn't have a sick parent requiring emergency funds or a brother with gambling debts. The absence of those classic markers made me feel, I realize now, like I was safe from the classic patterns. I was looking at the wrong list of warning signs. In December 2021, I transferred 180,000 baht, approximately $5,400 at that month's rate, to help cover a professional development course she wanted to complete, a certification in international commercial arbitration offered through a Bangkok-based institute affiliated with the ICC. She had described it with the specific frustration of someone who could see an opportunity and couldn't quite reach it. The course cost was significant relative to her legal secretary salary. I offered before she finished the sentence. She accepted with the matter-of-fact gratitude of someone who is accustomed to being taken seriously professionally, not with the excessive thanks that might have made the transaction feel transactional. I noted this. I approved of it. I told Steve, when I mentioned it to him in passing, that she was one of the more self-possessed people I'd met in years. He said, "Good, Doug. Just go slow." I said I was. In January 2022, she mentioned the investment opportunity for the first time. I want to be precise about how she did it, because the method matters. She didn't bring it up directly. She was talking about a colleague at her firm, a senior partner named Koen Arthit, who specialized in foreign investment structures for Thailand, helping expatriates navigate the legal requirements around property and business ownership. She mentioned him in the context of explaining something about Thai property law that had come up in conversation. She said he was very well regarded, that several of the firm's foreign clients used him for long-term financial structuring in Thailand. She didn't suggest I meet him, she simply mentioned him. The suggestion came from me, because I was already thinking about my own long-term financial situation, and here, conveniently, was a name. I think about that sequence now. The information was offered without a pitch. I asked for the meeting. She arranged it. In every subsequent recollection I had of the introduction, I was the one who initiated. I can see very clearly what that was designed to do to my sense of the arrangement. When you initiate something, you own it. You're not a victim of someone else's plan. You're the author of your own decision. That was the design. I was meant to be the author of my own undoing. Koen Arthit occupied a corner office on the 14th floor of his firm's Sathorn building, with a view toward the river and the kind of deliberately understated furnishing that signals confidence rather than display. He was 52, spoke excellent English, had studied law at Thammasat before completing a postgraduate certificate at the London School of Economics, and his manner was precisely calibrated to the type of client he evidently specialized in. Western, senior, accustomed to professional environments, and inclined to trust institutional signals. He was, by every available indicator, exactly the kind of lawyer I would have hired in Atlanta without a second thought. He walked me through what he described as a standard framework for foreign nationals seeking to establish long-term financial security in Thailand. Under Thai law, as he explained clearly and accurately, foreign nationals cannot own land directly. There were structures, however, Board of Investment promoted structures, long-term lease arrangements, and carefully constructed company vehicles that could provide effective control and economic benefit. He showed me examples. He had documentation. He had what appeared to be a portfolio of prior client arrangements, though I would later understand I had no way of verifying any of the details those documents contained. At the time, the documents looked exactly like the kind of thorough legal preparation I would have expected from a competent counsel. The investment he proposed, over the course of 2 meetings in January and February 2022, was a structured vehicle involving a Thai-registered company that would hold a long-term leasehold interest in a commercial residential mixed development in the Ari neighborhood north of Sukhumvit. The projected return, he told me, was between 8 and 11% annually, derived from rental income on the commercial ground floor units. The principal was secured, in his framing, by the underlying property value. The structure required a minimum commitment of 18 million baht, which at the February 2022 exchange rate was approximately $545,000. He suggested a slightly larger initial position of 19.2 million baht to allow for setup costs and the first year's management fee. That was $580,000. I had $575,000 in liquid capital. The precision of the alignment, which I should have found suspicious, felt instead like a sign that the structure had been designed thoughtfully for someone in my exact position. Between the second meeting with Koen Arthit and my decision to proceed, I had a conversation with Steve that I've replayed many times since. I called him on a Sunday in late February. He was in Houston by then, well out of the Bangkok chapter of his life, and I described the opportunity, not to get his approval, to think out loud in the way that you can only do with someone who knows both you and the context you're operating in. Steve was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then he said, carefully, that the return figures sounded high to him for a Thai property vehicle. He said he hadn't done anything like what I was describing and didn't know anyone who had. He asked if I'd had the documents reviewed by an independent lawyer, someone with no connection to Benz or to the firm. I said I hadn't and that I planned to. Then I told him the structure made sense to me professionally, that the legal documentation was thorough, and that Koen Arthit's credentials were verifiable. Steve said, I'm sure that's true, Doug. Just make sure your lawyer is your lawyer. I didn't fully understand what he meant. Or I understood and didn't apply it. I want to be specific about why I didn't apply it. Steve's concern, independent verification, a second opinion, ensuring that my legal counsel owed loyalty to me and not to the people who'd introduced us, was textbook risk management. I knew the principle. I had applied it thousands of times in a corporate context. The reason I didn't apply it here is not that I forgot the principle. It's that the principle requires you to first suspect that the person sitting across the desk might not be working for you, and suspecting that requires you to imagine a world where the relationship you're in, the relationship that is, at that moment, the most hopeful and alive thing in your life, was designed to position you for that meeting. I couldn't hold both of those possibilities simultaneously. I chose the one that cost less to believe. Because here is the thing about institutional trust, about the particular professional pathology that was my fatal flaw in all of this. When you spend 30 years inside large organizations, you develop a working model of professional relationships that is based on role function. The lawyer is hired to protect your interests. The accountant is there to ensure accuracy. The advisor is there to advise. You trust the role because the role has consistent institutional meaning. This model works inside corporations because the institutional structure creates accountability. Lawyers can be fired, disbarred, sued, their incentives constrained by regulatory frameworks and reputational consequences within a professional community where everyone knows everyone. What I failed to apply, what I, with 30 years of operational experience, somehow did not apply, was the obvious and elementary question, whose money was paying for this lawyer's time? The answer, which I would discover 8 months later, was Benz's family. I transferred $575,000 in 3 tranches between March and May 2022. The first transfer of $230,000 was made in March, against the initial company setup documentation. The second of $195,000 in April for the leasehold acquisition. A third of $150,000 in May for what the documentation described as construction completion costs on the residential portion of the development. Each transfer was accompanied by paperwork from Arthit's firm, registration documents, acquisition receipts, title references, that appeared complete and professionally prepared. I reviewed each package. I noted the references. I cross-checked the addresses against Google Maps, which showed the relevant RE neighborhood location and what appeared to be an active construction site. I felt, throughout this process, the particular satisfaction of a man who is being thorough. I noted the details. I asked the questions. I received answers that held together. I was careful. I was the most careful I knew how to be. The power of attorney document arrived in the second package, in April. It was presented as a standard operational requirement. Arthit explained that as a foreign national I could not sign certain Thai language documents in the company registration process, and that a limited power of attorney authorizing the company's Thai co-director to sign on my behalf for administrative purposes was routine. He had examples of similar documents from prior arrangements. He had a translation certificate. The scope of the power of attorney, as translated for me, covered administrative registrations, government filings, and operational paperwork. What it actually covered, in the original Thai, was substantially broader than that. I know this because a second lawyer, one I hired myself, 14 months later, reviewed the original and told me so with the kind of regret that a professional uses when the news is very bad and there's nothing to be done with it. The Thai co-director in the company vehicle was Benz's uncle. His name was Kun Wirasak, and I had met him twice at what were presented as routine investor meetings. A quiet man in his late 50s who said little and nodded often. He had been, throughout every interaction, functionally invisible to me. He was not, I would eventually understand, invisible to the company's assets. By September 2022, Benz and I were living together in a rented condominium near Lumpini Park. She had moved in during July with a naturalness that I didn't examine too carefully, because I was, by then, the happiest I'd been in 4 years. I want to say that clearly. Not for sympathy, I'm past the point of needing sympathy, but because I think the happiness matters to the account. It wasn't performance. It wasn't the result of naivety. I had been alone and grieving for 3 years, and I was happy, and the happiness was real, and it made the specific cognitive distortions of that period feel, from the inside, like health rather than impairment. There was a dinner in August with Wirasak and Benz's brother, a man named Kun Decho who was perhaps 40, well-dressed, confident in the manner of someone who moves through professional Bangkok without friction. The dinner was described as a family gathering, low-key, at a restaurant in the Thonglor district that I would not have found without being taken there. Looking back, it was a progress review. I was being checked against expectations. Decho asked me several well-calibrated questions about my operational background, my familiarity with Thai property markets, my plans for the non-immigrant B visa renewal. I was due to extend in November. I answered everything openly. I'm a direct man, and I'd spent decades in environments where directness was rewarded. I walked out of that dinner feeling that I had been welcomed into something. I walked out of a progress review feeling like a guest of honor. That's how good the calibration was. The non-immigrant B visa extension in November required evidence of the business investment I was maintaining. Arthit's firm provided a letter of engagement and the company documentation that served the purpose. The extension was granted without issue. I remember thinking, at the time, that everything was properly structured. The visa renewal confirmed it. The correct paperwork existed. The process worked as it was supposed to work. What I didn't understand was that the paperwork could be entirely genuine and entirely misleading simultaneously. That documents can accurately describe a structure that is not working in your interests. I noticed, from August onward, that her manner had changed in small ways that I catalogued without acting on. The scheduling of her availability became slightly less open. She began taking phone calls in the second bedroom, which she explained as work confidentiality. She was occasionally preoccupied in ways that she attributed to a difficult case at the firm, a corporate dispute that was apparently consuming significant partner time. I accepted each explanation individually. I did not aggregate them. That's the failure mode for someone with my kind of analytical training. I was applying individual evaluation to each data point rather than pattern recognition to the set. In my professional life, I would never have done that. I would have looked at the full picture. In my personal life, I didn't want to. In September, there was a request. Benz raised it over dinner on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because we usually ate out on Tuesdays and stayed in on Wednesdays. A domestic rhythm that I had settled into with the contentment of a man who has stopped being rootless. She said that Deco was in a short-term cash flow difficulty related to a property deal that had experienced a settlement delay. She said the amount was 650,000 baht, about $18,500, and that he needed it for perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. She said Wirasak had offered to provide part of it, but was currently illiquid from the same deal. She said the family didn't need my help, and she wouldn't ask if she thought it would be a problem, but that she wanted me to know the situation because she didn't like keeping things from me. She delivered this with no particular emotional pressure. It was, in every respect, a professional briefing. I transferred 650,000 baht the following week. No loan agreement, no timeline formalized in writing. 6 to 8 weeks came and went without repayment or reference. When I mentioned it to Benz in November, she said Decho was still managing the settlement delay and would return it with thanks as soon as it cleared. She mentioned it herself, before I could raise it the next time, a few weeks later, saying the same thing with the same calmness. After that, I didn't mention it again, because the dynamic I'd allowed to form was one where I was a man with resources and they were a family with temporary difficulties, and the politeness of the situation required that I not press. I had allowed that dynamic to be built around me, one conversation at a time, and by the time I understood it was a structure rather than a circumstance, I was already inside it. The quarterly report from Kun Arthit's firm arrived in October 2022 and showed the investment performing within projections, a return of 2.3% for Q3, consistent with the stated 8 to 11% annual range. The document was formatted exactly as the prior report had been. It had the correct letterhead, the correct reference numbers, the correct language. I filed it without further inquiry. I think about that filing now. I think about the 4 minutes I spent with that document, and the 3 months I gave it before the next one arrived. Then in November, something shifted. And I need to tell you how I found out, because it matters. Not for drama, but because the mechanism is the thing that people in my position most need to understand. I had retained an American accountant based in Bangkok, a man named Ron who worked with expatriate clients managing U.S. tax obligations while living abroad. Ron filed my FBAR, foreign bank account report, each year and handled the U.S. tax treatment of my Thai investment returns. In December 2022, he contacted me for the routine documentation he needed to complete my 2022 filings. I sent him the quarterly reports from Arthit's firm and the transfer records from my U.S. accounts. Ron came back to me 4 days later and asked, in an email whose tone I remember as carefully neutral, whether I had any documentation of the actual Thai company accounts, bank statements, audited financials, or a tax registration from the Thai Revenue Department. He said the information I'd provided was sufficient for reporting the transfers, but that for the income component, he'd want to see confirmation of the actual earnings at the source. Standard procedure. He was doing his job. I forwarded the request to Arthit. Arthit replied within 48 hours with a PDF. Ron looked at it and called me instead of emailing. That was the first sign. Professionals email when the news is neutral, Ron said, with the specific, careful tone of a man who does not want to say what he is about to say. That the document I'd forwarded appeared to be formatted with a Thai Revenue Department template that had been superseded in 2019. The department had updated its standard format that year, and the document used the old layout. He said he couldn't verify the company registration number in the document against any public record. He said he wasn't in a position to tell me what this meant, but that I should get independent Thai legal advice before proceeding with any further transactions. I sat at the desk in the study of the Lumpini condominium for a long time after that call. I remember it was a Thursday afternoon in December. The rainy season had ended, and the air outside was cleaner than it had been for months, and I could hear Benz in the kitchen doing something with dishes. I remember that specifically, the sound of dishes in the kitchen. I remember thinking that the sound was the sound of a normal life, and that I was about to do something that would change whether that life was real. I hired a new lawyer the following Monday. His name was Kun Prayun, and he was referred to me by the American Chamber of Commerce in Thailand, with whom I'd registered as a member in my first weeks in Bangkok. Kun Prayun was 60, a former public prosecutor, and he had the manner of a man who had seen a considerable number of foreigners in my position and had learned to deliver information without flinching. I gave him the full documentation package from Arthit's firm, the company registration materials, the power of attorney, the quarterly reports, and Ron's concerns. I did not tell Benz I'd done this. That was, I think, the first strategically sound decision I'd made in Bangkok. Prayun came back to me in 10 days. He asked to meet in person rather than communicate in writing, which told me what I needed to know before I arrived at his office. He started with the company vehicle, then he moved to the power of attorney. Then he showed me a document, a land department registration extract, that showed the RE property address from my acquisition paperwork registered to an entirely different entity than the one I'd invested in. He put these 3 things on the desk in front of me in sequence, not simultaneously, and he watched my face between each one with the practiced patience of someone who has learned that people need time between difficult revelations. I appreciated that about him. I was 65 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office in Bangkok, being shown evidence that the previous 14 months of my life had been a precisely engineered extraction, and he gave me the time between each piece of it to breathe. I remember the air conditioning in his office was set slightly too cold, and I was wearing a light linen jacket that wasn't quite enough for it. I remember that very specifically. I remember thinking I should have worn something heavier, which is an absurd thing to think when someone is explaining that you have lost $575,000. But the mind does what it does. It goes sideways. It finds the inconsequential detail and examines it, because the consequential detail is too large to look at directly. The company vehicle, the Thai-registered entity through which my investment was supposed to be held, was not registered in my name or in any structure that recognized my interest as an investor or shareholder. The company was registered with Weerasak as majority director and Benz's father, whose name I had never encountered in any document, as minority director. My name appeared nowhere in the registration. The power of attorney I had signed, the one described to me as administrative in scope, granted Weerasak authority to execute contracts, transfer assets, and represent the company in all dealings including property disposals. The scope was not limited to administrative functions. It was, Prayun said, as broad as a power of attorney in Thailand can legally be. The leasehold interest in the Ari development, the thing my money had supposedly purchased, did not exist in the company's name. The property at the address in the acquisition documents was owned by a separate entity that had no documented relationship to the company vehicle I'd invested in. The quarterly returns I had received were not drawn from any real income. Prayun said he could not determine with certainty where the payments had come from, but they were not from rental income on the stated property. Arthit's firm, he told me last, had a historical relationship with Benz's family that predated my introduction by at least 7 years. Prayun had found this through professional channels he didn't specify, and I didn't press. Arthit was not my lawyer. He had never been my lawyer. He was their lawyer, handling an arrangement designed to attract a foreign national with significant liquid capital, structure the transfer of that capital to a family-controlled vehicle, and provide enough professional scaffolding that the arrangement would withstand casual scrutiny for long enough to be irreversible. The scaffolding, Prayun said without any particular emphasis, had been quite good. When I asked him, and I did ask, directly, because I needed to understand the full shape of it, whether Benz had known the design of the arrangement from the beginning, he said that he could not prove it from the documents he had reviewed, but that the referral chain from Benz to Arthit to Weerasak, combined with the precision of the investment structure relative to my stated liquid capital, suggested coordination that was unlikely to have been coincidental. He said this in the neutral language of a professional man who is being careful not to say more than the evidence supports. I understood what he was not saying. I drove back to the condominium from Prayun's office in a taxi that took a long route through the Sathorn traffic, and I remember watching the city through the window in a way I hadn't since I first arrived, as something external, foreign, not mine. I calculated the loss in my head during that ride. $230,000 in March, $195,000 in April, $150,000 in May. Total, $575,000. Every dollar I had retired with. The quarterly payments I'd received, $14,300 over 3 payments, were not returns. They were, in effect, bait. The net loss was $560,700. I confronted Benz that evening. I want to be accurate about how that went, because the confrontation is one of the things people always want to know about, and the reality of it is less dramatic than you'd imagine. I told her what Prayun had found. I laid it out the way I would have laid out a risk analysis for a board presentation. The findings, the evidence, the conclusions. She listened to all of it without interruption. When I finished, she said, in a tone that I would describe as measured rather than emotional, "Douglas, you made investments in Thailand. You know how things work here. I helped you find the right people. What you're describing is a misunderstanding about the structure." She said it without anger, without tears, without any of the defensive escalation I'd been bracing for. She said it like a person who has prepared a position and is delivering it. I asked her directly whether she knew that Arthit was working for her family. She said, "Arthit works for many people. He worked for you. You hired him." And that was the thing. Technically, procedurally, I had hired him. I had asked for the referral. I had made the appointment. I had signed the engagement letter. In every formal sense, I had hired a lawyer who was, in every material sense, working for the people I was paying him against. I understood, in that moment, exactly why the arrangement had been structured the way it had been. I had needed to be the author. I had needed to ask for the meeting myself. Because if I'd asked for the meeting myself, I owned the decision. I asked her one more thing. I asked whether anything that had happened between us, the dinners, the conversations, the ceramics shop and the flower market, and the Sunday mornings on the condominium balcony looking at Lumpini Park, whether any of it had been real. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Everything was real, Douglas. The investment was just also real." And she left the room. I've thought about that answer for 2 years. I'm still not sure what she meant by it. I'm not sure she was lying. That might be the worst part. Prayun advised me on the legal options. They were limited. The power of attorney transfer to Wirasak had been executed in good faith, meaning my signature was valid and authenticated. The investment transfers were voluntary remittances from my U.S. accounts. No coercion, no forgery, just a man willingly sending money across an ocean to a structure that was never his. The company registration, while not structured as I'd been told, was not fraudulently registered under Thai law. It simply didn't contain my interests, and I had no documentation claiming it should. A civil action was possible, Prayun said, but the evidentiary requirements were substantial. The timeline was years, and the practical ability to recover funds from a well-constructed Thai family structure was historically poor. He had seen similar cases. He gave me the outcomes in percentages without me asking. The recovery rate he'd personally observed in comparable situations was below 12%. He said this with the directness I'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't soften numbers. Numbers meant more when they weren't softened. I called my son in Seattle the night after the meeting with Prayun. He's 38, works in finance, and is the person in my family most likely to understand the mechanics of what had happened without needing me to frame it emotionally first. I told him everything, from the members club introduction to the power of attorney, to Prayun's 12% recovery figure. He was silent for what felt like several minutes. Then he said, "Dad, we need to get you home." Not angry, not told you so, just come home. I told him I wanted to think about it. He said, "I know, but come home." I left Bangkok in February 2023. Benz had moved out of the condominium 2 weeks after my confrontation, without drama, taking her things in what appeared to be a pre-planned sequence, each day slightly fewer of her possessions, until one morning there was nothing left except a hair clip on the bathroom counter that I don't think she noticed. I put it in the trash and spent that afternoon sitting on the balcony looking at Lumpini Park and thinking about systems. I've always thought in terms of systems. How inputs become outputs, where the value flows, what the incentive structures are. I kept mapping the arrangement I'd been inside, the referral chain, the legal scaffolding, the role each person had played, the way my own professional habits had been weaponized against me. The system had been elegant. That's the honest assessment. It had been an elegant, well-designed system, and I had walked into it with 30 years of exactly the wrong kind of confidence. The morning I finally stopped mapping it and just sat with the view, I knew I was ready to go home. I stayed in Atlanta for about 4 months after I got back, at my younger son's house in Decatur, which he offered without conditions and which I accepted without the pride that might have complicated it at another time in my life. I'm 66 years old. I have approximately $11,000 in a U.S. checking account, a small monthly Social Security payment that won't begin until I turn 67, and a former colleague in Memphis who has offered me consulting work at a day rate that will allow me to rebuild something modest over the next several years if I'm very careful about how I spend what remains. I have my health. I have my sons. I have, as my older son keeps telling me, time, which at 66 is a thing you learn to count differently than you did at 40. What I want to tell you, and I've thought hard about how to say this in a way that's actually useful, rather than just cautionary, is that the failure here was not the failure of a credulous man. It was the failure of a sophisticated man who made one specific, foundational error. I assumed that professional context created professional loyalty. I assumed that a lawyer operating in a professional firm with professional credentials was, by virtue of that context, working for me. I did not ask the question that 30 years of corporate experience should have made automatic, who is paying this person, And what do they want from the transaction? That question, whose interests is this professional actually serving, is the question I asked in every corporate negotiation I ever participated in. I asked it about opposing counsel. I asked it about consultants. I asked it about advisors who appeared on the other side of the table with recommendations that happened to align with someone else's financial interests. I never once failed to ask it in a professional context, because in a professional context the question was obvious. In a personal context, in a context where I was happy and hopeful and introduced to a lawyer by a woman I trusted, I didn't ask it. That's the thing about sophisticated deception. It doesn't target your weaknesses. It targets your strengths and turns them against you. If you are in Thailand right now, in any kind of investment or financial arrangement, and your lawyer or your financial advisor was introduced to you by your partner or your partner's family, I need you to hear this. Stop every transaction immediately and have every document you've signed reviewed by an independent legal professional with no connection to anyone in your current network. Not tomorrow, this week. Independent means no referral chain. It means you found them through a chamber of commerce, an embassy list, or an international law firm with a home country presence. It means they have never met your partner. It means their fee comes only from you, and their obligation runs only to you. The money is gone. I'm making peace with that in the slow, non-linear way that you make peace with things that don't fit neatly into any category of loss. It's not grief, exactly. It's more like the feeling of having made a catastrophic professional error, which I've made before and recovered from, except those errors happened at 38, and this one happened at 64. But the mechanism, the specific mechanism of how it worked, I can explain that. And explaining it is the only thing I have left to give that costs me nothing and might, if you're in the right place at the right time and listening carefully enough, save you from something similar. I still have the business card Benz gave me the night we met. It's in my desk drawer and I'm not sure why I kept it. I look at it sometimes not with anger, but with something more like professional respect for the precision of the operation. Legal secretary. Partner's assistant. Excellent English. A private members club. A referral I requested. A lawyer whose credentials were genuine in every respect except the one that mattered. That's the work of people who understand how a certain kind of man makes decisions. They understood me better than I understood the situation. That's the honest summary. I don't know what happens to me from here. That's not a dramatic statement. It's just factually true, in a way it wasn't 2 years ago. I had a plan. The plan was destroyed. Now I have time, modest income, my sons, and 31 years of hard-won professional knowledge that turned out to be both my greatest asset and the precise instrument of my downfall. What I do with that going forward, I genuinely don't know, but I'd rather be uncertain and honest about it than certain and wrong. I've tried certain and wrong. I know how that ends.